All right, for the last time, I think, because this is going to be the last video, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you guys are watching this. So today we are going to be looking at, allow me to share my screen. Boop. We are farmers, looking at the last decade of Qing reform and Chinese revolutionary thought. We're going to look at the last decade of the Qing Dynasty, so 1901 to 1911. We're going to look at what's called the New Culture movement, roughly 1915 to the 1920s. And then we're going to look at the May 4th movement and the birth of Chinese Marxism, so 1919 to 1931. And after that, that's it. That's all she wrote. I'm so sad. Last video. All right. So let's get rocking and rolling. So let's start with the last decade. There we go. Last decade of the Qing Dynasty, 1901 to 1911. So I'm going to talk about late dynastic reforms. We're going to look at the three aspects. I'm going to emphasize three aspects of reform: military, educational, and institutional. And then the effects on reform. I'm going to look at the revolutionary movement. There are other people out there, but I'm going to specifically focus on Sun Yat-sen, Sun Yat-sen, 1866 to 1925. And then we're going to end the last decade of the Qing Dynasty with the Wu Cheng uprising in the 1911 revolution. All right. So late dynastic reforms. Now, we've been talking a lot about reforms in the previous couple of videos, but 1901 to 1911 is the last decade is going to be extremely vigorous in its reform, and it's inspired by, I hope, what I got out last lecture, but this fundamental shift in the political landscape. I mean, by 1901, the Empress Dowager herself is suggesting more reforms, more radical reforms to save the nation. It's important that by 1901 to note that it's important to note that by 1901, she says she's focusing on saving the nation rather than saving the dynasty. All the previous reform put forth by her or supported by her, and that's focused on maintaining the dynasty. After 1901, she focuses on the nation being saved. And so she will do things like establish a Bureau of Government Reform. She will try to repair the linkages between the West and China with respect to the economy. And this, surprisingly enough, this period of reform will be accompanied by a sense of optimism. Now, as I said, there are three aspects of reform I want to talk about: military, educational, and institutional. With military, we have military industrialization. Now, we're looking at, I'm going to use this phrase I used way back when, a new style army. It's very similar to Cromwell's new model army. This new style army is now an army primarily focused with the nation in mind. So it's a shift away from regionalism, and it's an army that's trained by German officers and supplied with Western weapons. German officers, because at this point, Germany is seen as the preeminent land military power. Britain is seen as a preeminent naval power. So if any nation is going to be looking for naval transformation, they're going to look at Britain. If they're looking for army transformation, they're going to look at Germany. And while we have this industrialization coming, it's interesting, this shift in public attitude, public perception towards the military. Before, I mean, pretty much in the 19th century, the military is seen as, well, you can't do anything else. You're just a dregs of society. Go join the army. But now, starting in 1901, the military is seen as a position of prestige, an avenue for the elite. With educational reform, remember back to Kang Yu-wei. By 1905, the Chinese government, with the Empress Dowager still making the decisions, 1905, the examination system is officially abolished. And so education, schooling, was patterned on Western models. So we have the introduction of Western subjects like math, science, logic. We have the introduction of women starting in 1907 to educational schools. I know that's a bit of an oxymoron, educational schools, but women are being admitted to schools starting in 1907. Now, there's limited funding. Funding's primarily in the cities, in the urban areas, but there's also limited funding. And that's because, similar to what you see, let's say, in the United States, the elite did not buy into this educational reform. So the elite, the people who have the money, who can afford it, would send their children abroad to study. So children would be sent to Oxford. They would be sent to Paris. They would be increasingly sent to American schools along the West Coast, as well as schools in the East Coast, like Columbia. But this, and I made this analogy to U.S. education, and what happened and is happening in the United States is whites, especially upper class whites, will either break away from their school district to make their own school district, or they will send their students to charter schools or preparatory schools, which means that the funding that could be sent to the educational district is effectively taken away. And with respect to China, what this means is not only do you have limited funding, but now it also makes the new education system a little more expensive, because now you have to pay for tuition, now you have to pay for new materials, you have to pay for room and board. But there's still a sense of optimism with this educational reform. And there's also institutional reform, because during this period between 1901 and 1911, you have a shift to the constitutional monarchy model. So basically what you find is almost everything that Kang Yu-wei wanted in 1898 is being implemented in this period, 1901 to 1911. I apologize, guys. I'm going to have to put you, going to have to go on pause for a minute, because there is a big truck going right outside my window. He's back. The joys of working from home. That was the lawnmower, by the way. All right, so let us get back to where we were. Sure. So the effects, so as I was trying to say, is basically everything that Kang Yu-wei was saying in 1898 is now being implemented in this last decade of the Qing Dynasty, 1901 to 1911. Now, obviously, because we're talking about the last decade of the Qing Dynasty, the reforms didn't really work. So why did they fail? What were some of the effects? Well, the reforms failed because of halfway attempts at reforms, it undermined rather than bulwarked the dynasty. Rather than helping to prop up the dynasty, these attempts at reforms kind of aided the foundations. So, for example, we have military reform. Well, the new armies are going to end up being more loyal to the nation than loyal to the dynasty. As we'll see in 1911, it'll be military officers who would lead to the overthrow of the dynasty and then set up provincial fiefdoms, provincial areas as warlords. With education, I mean, the importation of more radical Western ideas through students who are studying abroad. And it'll be, as we will see, the students who will provide agitation towards revolution. And in 1905, when they abolished the examination system, that led to some even questioning without the examination system, without the bureaucracy, without a way into the bureaucracy, why do we need a dynasty? And then the institutional reform, the shift to a constitutional monarchy model, well, it alienated the provincial elites. And because you have institutional reform at the top, that implies an immediate rejection of any provincial attempts at reform. So the provinces are going, well, we're alienated because you're not even listening to what we're trying to say. We have no attempt at shaping or even creating policy. So the provincial elites are even more alienated than they were before. And into all this steps the revolutionary movement. Steps the revolutionary movement. And this is a new political movement in the Chinese landscape led by, there we go, led by Sun Yat-sen, seen here on my left, your right, I think. Sun Yat-sen, also, in Chinese, Sun Yixan, S-U-N space Y-I-X-I-A-N. He's known as the father of the Chinese Republic. And his primary appeal to the people was explicitly an anti-Manchu appeal. In 1905, he sets up or helps establish what's known as the Revolutionary Alliance. Originally made up of a number of small, disparate organizations within the urban areas. But with Sun Yat-sen and others, he helps coalesce the Revolutionary Alliance into the Nationalist Party. Now, there's two ways of spelling this. There's two ways of pronouncing this. I'm going to go to the key terms. Two ways. There's Guomindang, G-U-O-M-I-N-D-A-N-G, the GMD. And there's also the Kuomintang. There's going to be the same organization, just spelt two different ways. Q-U-O-M-I-N-T-A-N-G, the KMT. Same people, just different ways of pronunciation. By the way, Sun Yat-sen, right here. And as I said, also in Chinese, Sun Yixan, 1866 to 1925. Now, he is one of these people who were Western educated. He was sent to the West for his education. And some have referred to him as China's first modern revolutionary. Now, tell me if this doesn't sound a little bit familiar. Sun Yat-sen was born to a Hakka family in the Guangdong province. So he's at the same ethnic group as Hong Jiquan, from the same region. And he was raised on stories of the Taiping Rebellion and the Taiping Revolution. And Sun Yat-sen believed that the whole political system, the whole Chinese political system, was rotten enough that all it needed was just a little shove, a little push to have everything come falling over. Falling over, I almost used the phrase, I'm just going to ignore that. But he believed the whole political system was broad enough that all it needed was just a little push and Humpty Dumpty will come crashing down. And so he came up with what's known as the 3 principles of the people. This was an attempt to try to gain support from the educated class. These 3 principles of the people are collectively known as the San-Min Doctrine. The San-Min Doctrine. And these are, as the PowerPoint suggests, nationalism, democracy, and the people's livelihood. Now, nationalism, I mean, that's freedom from imperialist domination. Because, I mean, if we go back to this map, nationalism being freedom from imperialist domination, you have the Russians, there we are, you have the Russians, you have the Japanese, you have the English, you have the Germans, you have the French, you have the British. So much foreign domination. So nationalism, this idea of freedom from imperialist domination. Democracy, his focus there is on Western constitutional government. So he focused on the power of the people to express their political wishes. So we're talking about things like elections, things like recall elections, things like referendum. These are basically policies that are put before the people and they're voted on either up or down. The people are given the power of governance. And if we go way back to the beginning, Sun Yat-sen is trying to bring this idea of popular sovereignty to China. And then with people's livelihood, well, that's more the idea of social welfare, helping to provide for food, for clothing, for housing, for transportation. And so that's the San-Min Doctrine. That's an attempt by Sun Yat-sen to get and gain support from the educated class. Now, according to Sun Yat-sen, there are 3 stages of revolution. So after you have the revolution, you have a period of military rule. You have a period of tutelage. What he means by that is guided democracy. Basically, a period where you have the people being ruled by a small group that's transitioning towards democracy. And then the final stage is constitutional democracy. So for Sun Yat-sen, it is not just, boom, we have a revolution, now we have constitutional democracy, but rather it's a transitional period. We have a revolution, then we go to military rule, a period of tutelage, guided democracy, and then finally we achieve the goal of a constitutional democracy. And Sun Yat-sen's appeal is he always tried to present the best possible front to the audience at hand. So if he's talking to students, if he's talking to the educated class, he's going to emphasize the San-Min Doctrine. If he's talking to the gentry class, he's talking to the educated class, he's going to talk about the San-Min Doctrine. And in that, he could talk about land reform, the need for the people to start owning their own land. Yet if he's in front of the gentry, if he's in front of a landed class, he's not going to talk about land reform. He's not going to talk about, yes, we're going to take all the land from all those landholders and give it to everybody else, because that will alienate them. And part of his appeal was his sense of optimism, his inherent belief in not only the success of the revolution, the fact that the revolution will succeed, but the imminence of it, the fact that the revolution is at hand. And through organizing, through making his appeals, Sun Yat-sen was able to get access to money and get access to manpower. Which brings us here to the 1911 revolution. And so revolution does not happen overnight. And so we have the building of support for revolution. In 1908, 1909, it's starting to become apparent to modern gentry that political reform of the dynasty was meant to concentrate the power, not diffuse it, not bring it to everybody else. And so we're starting to have revolutionary propaganda becoming widely circulated, particularly amongst the army. And so in 1911, we have the Wu Chang uprising. It's an uprising by a small number of army officers who had the advantage of having control over not only the provincial arsenal, but the provincial treasury. So they have at the province level, they have power and control over the coercive power, the military, but also the economic power, the treasury of the department. And so with this uprising, they're able to slowly gain support throughout the various provinces to start building for an uprising. And over time, you have the gentry and the provincial assemblies meet. And at this meeting, all but 5 of the northern provinces break away from the empire. So in 1911, we have the fragmentation of China, where basically everything but the core Manchu area basically secedes, breaks away from China. And they're supported by the local military, they're supported by the local provincial capital, that is money. And in 1912, the provincial assemblies send delegates to Nanjing, dedicated as the capital. Nanjing is the capital. And the provincial assemblies send delegates to Nanjing, where they declare the Chinese Republic and elect Sun Yat-sen as its first president. So by 1911, there is no more Qing dynasty. So next, I want to talk about this new culture movement. And I want to talk about this idea of a cultural revolution. Now, it's very important, especially when we're talking about Chinese history. The term cultural revolution has a very specific meaning when it comes to the 1960s. So when I'm talking about cultural revolution, I'm not talking about what's happening under Mao. I'm talking about a new culture movement that is taking place between 1915 to the 1920s. I'm going to talk about a couple of people. I'm going to talk about Chen Duxiu here. I'm going to talk about Hu Shi. Those are going to be the two I'm going to focus on. Now, this new culture movement, this idea of a cultural revolution, happened because the major obstacle for Chinese modernity is not, or by 1911, is now not seen as the Manchus it's a major obstacle. It's not seen as the imperial system is the major obstacle, but rather the major obstacle is Chinese culture itself. And so they identify 2 problems. They identify the problem of unequal hierarchy. This idea of filial piety, that you have to have faith. You have to have faith in my body. You have to have faith, filial piety to your father, to your family. And these Confucian relationships that Chinese society is based on, as you go up from your peasant house, you have family loyalty, family piety to your father, to your village, which tends to be family oriented, to the community, to the market community, to the provincial capital, to the empire. This problem of unequal hierarchy, this idea of filial piety, is seen as an obstacle to reform, and the subservience to patriarchal society. The fact that the emperor was seen as a father to everybody. And this goes down as we go down the levels. The subservience to a patriarchal society prevents any political reform, prevents any political independence. That's the first problem that they have to get over. The second is the problem of adherence to ritual, to Li, as I talked about before. Because this is a social system based on ritual and based on set patterns of past. And so how can you modernize if everybody's always looking backwards? And so we have arguments that political reform, the reform of the body politic, is based on the reform of society. And so what we find in between 1915 and the 1920s is culture and education takes precedence over political reform. And so I'm going to get my face out of there for a second. There we are. So I want to talk about a couple of major themes and personalities. I'm going to focus on two. I'm going to focus on Chen Duxu, 1879 to 1942. And then I'm going to focus on Hu Shi. So Chen Duxu, 1879 to 1942, and the New Youth. So Chen studied in France. He was one of those people who were educated in the West and then came back to China. And when he returned to China, he founded the newspaper, The New Youth. And in The New Youth, he railed against the old society. And initially, he espoused Western, that is, democratic, scientific values, and getting rid of the old dead weight in society. So the New Youth was focused on the youth. And the journal, so this is taking place after 1898. This comes into being, the New Youth does, in that period in 1898 where we have a sprouting of newspapers, the study societies. The New Youth was one of these first modern journals to come, and it was a launching pad for Chen Duxu. And so the New Youth, as the title suggests, it exalts the youth. And the journal had a widespread circulation, especially in the urban areas, and became one of the main organs, one of the main journals for Chinese intellectualism. And so he has, as the PowerPoint suggests, 6 guiding principles in the New Youth. So you can sort of see where he's going with this. Independence instead of servility. This goes along with this idea of railing against filial piety. How can we be independent if we always have to listen to the people above us? If we have to be servile to our father, to the village elder, to whoever, how can we be independent? Progressivism instead of conservatism. This idea that progressivism and conservatism, not in political terms, but rather progressivism as in looking forward versus conservatism looking to the past. aggression instead of passivity. This idea that reform up to this point has been much too passive, and China has been reacting instead of acting. Cosmopolitanism instead of isolationism. This idea that China must engage in the world rather than being isolated from it. Utilitarian beliefs instead of impractical traditions. This idea, similar to progressivism, that beliefs need to be useful. There needs to be something useful in the world rather than traditions that don't really have a use. And then scientific knowledge instead of visionary insight. What he means by this is an emphasis on science versus popular religion. Chen Duxiu will help found the Chinese Communist Party, and this conversion to Marxism, or Chen Duxiu's conversion to Marxism, will also help shift the editorial voice of the New Youth, which kind of makes sense. And he shifted to Marxist thinking because he believed that Marxism was the wave of the future, this idea of progressivism. He was purged, not killed, but purged by the Chinese Communist Party in 1927 for, well, the charge was, quote, right opportunism. In other words, they charged him with fraternizing with the enemy, essentially. Basically having friends on the right side of the political spectrum. As well as for temporarily using the political right to engage in progress. So Chen Duxiu is very influential in trying to sort of get them young, get the youth engaged politically and engaged in trying to change society. Now this gentleman here, who's she? Who's she? He, she. Ha ha ha, I use that joke every year. Hu Shi, 1891 to 1962. He is one of these youths that are coming out of this whole youth movement. I mean, he's only 20 when the 1911 revolution happens. Hu Shi also will study abroad. In his case, he'll study in the United States at Cornell and Columbia universities. And Hu Shi will argue for the total reform of Chinese language. And so what he will emphasize is a shift away from classical Chinese, Mandarin Chinese as it's known, to a more vernacular Chinese, a Chinese that is spoken, and I've talked about dialects before, but a Chinese that is spoken at a regional level. I mean, for me, I grew up in the 80s and 90s. I had a number of international students from China in my elementary and high school. And the way they referred to it, which is why I'm referring to it as this, and I apologize if I'm referring to it wrong, but it's Mandarin, which would be the classical Chinese, versus Cantonese, the more vernacular, the more regional Chinese. And Hu Shi, with respect to language reform, argues for the same style of characters. Look, we don't have to change the alphabet, but we just have to change and base the written language on how it is spoken. So a good example for you guys is academic writing versus personal writing. With academic writing, you tend to construct your sentences in a different manner. Not so much that you're trying to sound smarter, but you're trying to make sure your ideas are academically clear and supported. Now compare that to texting or writing an email. You're not going to use the same sort of sentence structure, sentence construction in an email than you are in an essay. Although I should point out, if you do send emails to your professor, number one, say who you are, so we know who you are. But number two, I've had this happen. Hey dog, how it going? Can y'all give me an extension, yo? Thanks. Same language, same alphabet, different construction of language. And so, but with Huxi, I mean, he wanted easier dissemination of information. I mean, really, it's the same idea that we have with Gutenberg, same idea that we have with Martin Luther, trying to get information to the masses. So he wants the dissemination of information, literacy, participation in politics brought to the masses of the people. And for Huxi, I mean, this is a way to challenge the hold of Confucianism on the elite. Now he's not, this is only successful over a short period of time. In fact, once once communists come over, basically things start changing. Huxi, yeah. It's only short-term successful, but it is part and parcel of this new culture movement, a new way of thinking, a new way of communicating this thinking. So I'm going to end this lecture and I'm going to end the class with the May 4th movement and the birth of Chinese Marxism. So we're looking 1919 to 1931. So what is the May 4th movement? Well, the May 4th movement will take place on the 4th of May. Surprise, surprise. It'll take place on the 4th of May, 1919. And it began in the colleges and universities in Beijing and Shanghai. Now, in part because, again, we have people like Chen Duxiu emphasizing the youth. And so the character of Beijing University is starting to change with a change in leadership in 1916. And so with this change of leadership in 1916, the character of the Beijing University shifts towards an emphasis on the new youth. And the May 4th incident, the protest, sparks, there we go, with sparks in 1915, with the infamous 21 demands put on China from Japan in 1915, because in 1915, most of the year, let's rephrase, yeah, I'll do most. Most of the Europeans were kind of focused on Europe. I mean, you have Australia kind of paying attention here for Britain, but pretty much everybody's eyes were focused on Europe, which meant that Japan acted as the leading imperial power in China. And so in these 21 demands, they wanted things such as an expanded sphere of influence in Shandong. They wanted expanded Japanese spheres of influence in southern Manchuria and inner Mongolia. I'll go back to going back to the map. So Japan wanted basically a larger sphere of influence overall. In addition, they wanted to bar China from giving any foreign power, other than Japan, any concessions. So basically, what Japan is trying to do in 1915 is make these 21 demands. There's obviously a number of other demands. And use these demands to effectively colonize China. I apologize. Give me a second. There is another lawnmower about to come by. Again, the joys of recording stuff from home. All right, back to share screen. Sure. All right. All right, going back to May 4th movement. So this is all just background. So we have I was talking about the 21 demands. There we go. China agreed to a number of the demands. They did not agree to closing of borders to everybody. Japan had pressure put on them by the United States and Britain. But what ends up happening is by the end of the war, by Versailles, Japan is given basically the former German concessions. I should have stayed on the same map. I apologize. So, by the way, Shandong province located around here. Basically, Japan is given the former German concessions after Versailles. China is pretty much ignored with the Treaty of Versailles. And what ends up happening on 4 May 1919 is we have a spontaneous protest movement against pretty much the capitulation of the Chinese government in Versailles. So these are protests against the Chinese government. And they are put down by the Chinese government. But the May 4th incident incites a movement. And May 4th is regarded as a symbolic galvanizing date where you have this strong patriotic spirit beginning to infuse with the intellectual trends. And so what are these intellectual trends? Well, they are what I refer to as a debate over the isms. So we have three major intellectual trends and ideologies happening in China at this time. We have liberalism / pragmatism, we have cultural conservatism, and then we have Marxism. So as I said, the intellectual trends and ideologies can almost be seen as a debate between the three. With liberalism or pragmatism, think democracy American style. So with respect to liberalism, with respect to that, think more Western style democracy, particularly American style democracy. With cultural conservatism, well, that's more of a reactionary movement to the May 4th movement. Cultural conservatives argued that that it was Western values that brought about World War I. And so Western values should be repudiated in China. And that Chinese culture provides a balance between Western materialism and more Indian spirituality. This idea that the idea that the cultural conservatives are trying to bring is they're trying to bring China as the Middle Kingdom, essentially. And what I mean by that is China is a happy ground between religious extremism and material extremism. And then we have Marxism. This is pushed into prominence by the Russian Revolution in 1917, in particular because Russia is seen as similar to China with respect to population. And I mentioned this when I talked about Peter the Great. It's a predominantly peasant population. Well, Marxism was also helped by the fact that Lenin basically said, we are giving up any Russian claims to any territory in China. So that appealed to a lot of nationalists. Now, I'm going to put the first two isms aside. We're going to leave liberalism aside, we're going to leave cultural conservatism to the side, and we're going to focus on Marxism. And so we're going to look at this period between 1921 and 1927, known as the United Front period. We're going to look at the splintering of the United Front. There we go. And then I'm going to talk about the Chinese Communist Party in the wilderness, so to speak. So the rest of the lecture is going to be focused on primarily the rise and creation of the Chinese Communist Party. So let's talk about the Sinification, the Chinese adapting to Marxism. Because according to Marxist thought, several conditions need to be present in society before a revolution can take place. You needed industrialization, you needed a capitalist society, you needed a vanguard. And so Chinese Marxists were reading Das Kapital. They were reading other Marxist treatises like the Communist Manifesto. And going, how, so Marx is focused on predominantly a Western European society. How can we adapt his ideas to a Chinese society focused 80% on peasants? And so they needed to adapt Marxist thought to the Chinese situation. And they argued that China was a nation of built up, pent up energy, because they felt, the Chinese did, the forced stagnation of peasant society. All this reform I've been talking about in the previous videos, very, very little of it affected the peasant society. The peasant society remained relatively stagnant. And so Chinese Marxists argued that this enforced stagnation meant that the peasant society had so much potential pent-up energy to allow the revolution to proceed without the conditions as set up by Marx were not met. So revolution, a social revolution, can occur even if we don't have a proletariat, even if we don't have a Western European capitalist society. Because one of the things that Marx and Engels emphasized was the need of a proletariat, a need for a working class from whence the revolution will spring. China had no proletariat of which to speak of. So Chinese Marxists said, okay, we need a surrogate. We need a substitute proletariat. In this case, they emphasized the peasant class. They emphasized this idea of a collective nation. And they said that this will be the wellspring of Chinese Marxism. This will be for China where the Marxist revolution will come from. So the Comintern. I'm sure a lot of you guys are not familiar with this term. The Comintern is just a shortened way of saying the Communist International. It's a worldwide organization trying to be an umbrella organization for the various communist parties throughout the world. And so a group from the Comintern was sent by Moscow to China to sort of help coagulate, to sort of help bring together the revolutionary zeal. And when the Chinese Communist Party was founded in 1921, it had a membership of 50 people. So obviously, it was not in a position to dictate. And so the main goal of the Comintern at the time was to try to, first and foremost, grow the Communist Party in China. But secondly, to make sure it would survive. And to survive, the Comintern urged that the party develop a united front, a popular front with the Nationalist Party. Again, that is the Kuomintang. Come on, there we go. Again, multiple ways of spelling it. Kuomintang, Kuomintang, the KMT. Also the Guomindang, Guomindong. Two different ways, same organization. It's a nationalist party. And so the Comintern said, work with the Nationalist Party. Promote the unity of China from the warlords. Because by this point, China had basically, the Chinese government controlled basically the area around Nanjing. Other than that, China had been broken into a series of regions controlled by a number of different warlords. And it's a nationalist party who's trying to bring China back together. And so they argued, work with this nationalist party to promote the unity of China. And so, getting back to the PowerPoint, one more, two more, I lag. And so they also started emphasizing Lenin's interpretation of imperialism. What was Lenin's interpretation of imperialism? Well, for lack of a better term, imperialism sucks. That's a very, very, very short way of saying it. And so by emphasizing the Leninist interpretation of imperialism and decolonization, the Comintern, believed that the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, would be able to grow quickly and try to even work some moderates in with them. And the Nationalist Party and Sun Yat-sen are receptive at this time due to the military and economic needs of China. So what were the terms of the United Front? Well, as the Chinese Communist Party grew, as they gained more and more people other than the 50, they are able to provide outside assistance. The Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, has access to the Comintern based in Moscow. And so the Comintern offers the Nationalist Party and Sun Yat-sen money. They offer them weapons. They offer them revolutionary advice, basically arguing, trying to organize the Nationalist Party along Leninist lines. Yes, it's a right party. It's the Nationalist Party, but they provide organization. And this united front is forged for one goal only. It's forged for the defeat of the various warlords in China and the unification of the entirety of China. And the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, as part of the terms of the United Front, was allowed to remain as a separate entity within the Nationalist Party. The hope for the CCP, their goal was to hopefully infiltrate and take over the Nationalist Party from within. Didn't really work, but yeah. Now, the division of labor within the United Front, well, they played to their strengths. The CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, was allowed to run the propaganda for the United Front and focus on the organization of labor and the organization of the peasants, which was a great recruiting ground for the Chinese Communist Party. The Nationalist Party, well, they organized the army, they ran the foreign affairs, and they ran the government. And so they established a school for training an officer corps. And this school was run by a man named, there we are, Jiang Jieshi. In the West, he's known as Chiang Kai-shek. And so, 1924, Sun Yat-sen dies, and Jiang Jieshi, Chiang Kai-shek, takes control of the Nationalist Party after his death. You have a period of factionalism within the Nationalist Party, but Jiang Jieshi, Chiang Kai-shek, comes to the foreground, takes over. And because Chiang Kai-shek spent just a little bit of time in Moscow to get training for helping to organize the army, the Comintern said, yeah, he's great. We love him. Yeah, we can use him. Yes, he's great. We'll accept him. What they weren't expecting, however, was Chiang Kai-shek's extreme right turn politically because of his fear of radicalism from the communists. Which leads to the splintering of the United Front, 1926-1927. Here we have a picture of FDR, that would be Churchill, and here is Chiang Kai-shek himself, Jiang Jieshi. And so we'll talk briefly about the splintering of the United Front before we talk about the CCP in the wilderness. Because in 1926, the Nationalist Party starts a crackdown on the communist wing in the party. They try to patch things up. My bad, I'm sorry, I hate you. But the splits within the United Front are evident. 1926-1927, we have what's called the Northern Expedition, launched by the nationalist forces against northern warlords. And the preparation for the march north was done through communist labor and peasant groups. So the CCP really laid the foundation for this northern expedition. Now the Nationalist Party does not go after all the northern warlords at once. They play some off against others. In some cases, in at least one case I could think of off the top of my head, they literally bribe one warlord to just change sides. But by the end of 1927, the Nationalist Party had basically secured the last remnants of the warlords in China, and by 1927 had basically secured the integrity of China. So 1926, I talk about a bit of a crackdown, but they realized we still need the communists. We're going to head up north through their territory. We don't want to mess with them yet. After the Northern Expedition, well, the Nationalist Party turns its attention fully to the communists. And in 1927, we have what's called the White Terror. And the Nationalist Party's suppression of communists in Shanghai and elsewhere, Chiang Kai-shek finishes the crackdown that he started in 1926. We have mass arrests, we have executions, which leads to not just the CCP, not just the Chinese Communist Party splitting away from the United Front, but the entire left wing, moderates included, of the Nationalist Party splits away from them. The Chinese Communist Party flees, retreats to the interior, heads to Wuhan province, a province familiar to us today for a totally different biomedical reason. So they retreat and reconstitute in Wuhan province. They're militarily weak. They're unable to stand up to the Nationalist Party through force of arms. So the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, reconstitutes in Wuhan. And the Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, reformed and reshifts after the left wing of its party leaves under the complete control of Chiang Kai-shek. And what he does is he sets up an autocratic democracy. The Nationalist Party will control most of the cities, as well as the southern areas of China. The rural areas will be predominantly the domain of the CCP, at least in the future. And some small warlords will pop up from time to time. So the fate of the CCP after the White Terror, well, it was decimated and driven out of the urban areas to the countryside. We're talking a loss of 80%, 80% of the membership completely gone, which forces the Chinese Communist Party to shift from an urban-oriented rebellion to a peasant-oriented rebellion. And this shift becomes one of necessity rather than choice. Now, the fact that Stalin and Russia did not provide any help, did not provide any support during the White Terror, planted the seeds of distrust of the Soviet Union by the Chinese communists. But as they reconstitute, the Chinese Communist Party realizes the importance of having its own independent military force. Because in the United Front, the Nationalist Party controlled the military, the Chinese Communist Party propaganda and recruiting. So they didn't really have any way to protect themselves from something like the White Terror. So they started building up their own military force, which leads to this period of the wilderness, the CCP in the wilderness. This was a romanticized period, especially on the communist side, between 1927 and 1931. And during this period, we have the slow, reluctant abandonment of the urban policy for a rural policy. They're trying to salvage as much as they could. But after several unsuccessful urban uprisings. They realize that the urban areas, the cities, that's not our jam. We have to start working from amongst the peasants. And so they start setting up communist bases throughout the countryside, particularly in the mountainous border regions where it's harder for the Nationalist Party to attack them. They have little by way of resources. There's little to no military resources. But we have the establishment of a guerrilla doctrine, Guerrilla, a guerrilla doctrine, where the CCP understands the need for a fixed base. We can't just be moving around all the time. We have to have set bases in mountainous border areas that's hard to get to, but we need these bases. We need the support of the local population. We cannot have hit and run tactics. We cannot attack the Nationalist Party base and then blend into the local populace if there's no support from the local populace. And we need to have the military under party control. So, sad to say, I'm going to stop there, not just for this video, but for the lecture, but for the class itself. Thank you for going along this journey with me. This, as I said at the beginning, was just a beta test to see how things would work in an online environment for me as well as for you guys. I hope you enjoyed it, and again, I hope you fill out the surveys, fill out the online surveys that were sent out to you, the evaluations. Let me know what worked for you. Let me know what didn't work for you so I can know how to adapt. So I can be like the Chinese Communist Party and figure out with what low resources I have, how can I make this better for you guys? All right, it's been a pleasure. I'm going to stop recording now and get these uploaded. Remember, paper due on Wednesday by 23:59. Final exam, 8 a.m. a week on Wednesday. All right. I will have office hours regular time on Thursday. I will also have them on the Tuesday before the final exam if you want to come and ask questions about any material that we've talked about throughout the videos. All right, go forth, slay dragons, and I will see you later. Bye.